The dust rose high that morning over the edge of Clearwater County. The sun had barely climbed over the ridges when wagons started rolling into town, their wheels crunching over the dry gravel like distant thunder. Word had spread fast. An auction was being held in the square, and not just for cattle or horses this time. It was for a woman, a bride in chains. Folks came from miles around, some out of curiosity, others just to have something to whisper about later. The sheriff leaned against a post outside the saloon, hat tilted low, pretending not to care. But even he couldn't ignore the sight of the young woman being led up onto the platform. Her wrists were bound in front of her, raw from the iron cuffs that had rubbed her skin for days. A short, torn veil clung to her tangled hair. She wasn't crying. Her face was set in a stillness that hurt worse than tears. They said her name was Lila May. Once, she'd been promised to a landowner's son from over in Ridgefield, a marriage arranged to settle a debt. But the groom had fled the night before the wedding, leaving her father bankrupt and furious. In a fit of shame and vengeance, the old man handed her over to the town marshal, claiming she was his to sell, to make good on what was lost. That was how Lila found herself standing barefoot on the platform, the chains biting at her ankles, while men laughed below her. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square. He was the kind who'd sell a soul for the right price, his words slick with whiskey and sin. We got ourselves a hard worker here, strong, quiet, and obedient, he shouted, tapping his cane on the wooden floor. Let's start the bid at $20. The crowd murmured. Someone chuckled. 20? For damaged goods. Another man called out. Laughter rippled through the onlookers like a cruel wind. Lila kept her eyes down. The dust clung to her lashes, and her heart pounded so loud she thought they might hear it. Every word cut deeper than the chains. She'd been raised to believe a woman's worth came from grace, decency, and hard work. But here, under the scorching sun, her worth was a number shouted by strangers. $10, barked a ranch hand near the front. His grin showed missing teeth and no kindness. Another man raised it to 15, just for the thrill of owning something that used to dream. The auctioneer grinned wider. Now we're talking. Who'll give me 20, 25? And that's when the laughter stopped. From the back of the crowd, a low voice spoke. It wasn't loud, but it carried, the way thunder carries before a storm breaks. $50. Heads turned. The man who'd spoken stood alone near the hitching post, dust clinging to his worn duster coat. His hat shadowed most of his face, but his eyes, clear, gray, and quiet, met Lila's for a heartbeat. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. The auctioneer hesitated. 50? Well, sir, that's cash, the man said. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and tossed it onto the platform. It landed with the heavy jingle of coins. The crowd fell into a hush. No one knew him well, though most had seen him before. His name was Caleb Turner, the widowed rancher from the edge of Broken Arrow Valley. Folks said he lived alone after his wife died in childbirth 3 years back, raising a small boy who hadn't spoken a word since his mother passed. The auctioneer cleared his throat, uncertain now. Sold to Mr. Caleb Turner. Lila didn't move when they unlocked her chains. Her arms hung limp, the cold metal replaced by the ache of disbelief. Caleb stepped forward, took off his hat, and spoke to her softly. You can walk beside me. No one's gonna touch you now. She followed him through the silent crowd. Every eye watched her. Some curious, others mocking, but no one dared speak. Caleb's horse was tied out front. He helped her mount, his hands gentle but firm. Then he climbed up behind her, gave the reins a flick, and they rode out of Clearwater as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm broke before they reached his ranch. Thunder rolled across the plains, and Lila clung to the saddle horn, her dress soaked and heavy. Caleb guided the horse through the dark, the faint glow of his lantern the only thing cutting through the downpour. When they finally reached the house, a small wooden structure built against the rise of a hill, he led her inside and lit the stove. You'll find dry clothes in the chest, he said quietly. They were my wife's. Might fit. She didn't speak, just nodded. Her voice trapped somewhere deep inside. He left her alone to change, then came back with a towel and a steaming cup of coffee. The warmth stung her hands as she took it. Caleb sat across the table, eyes on the fire. I know what folks said back there, he murmured. You don't owe me anything. I didn't buy you to own you. He paused, as if weighing each word carefully. My boy hasn't spoken in near 3 years. Doctor says he might not ever again. But maybe he just needs someone who ain't broken inside the same way I am. The words settled in the small room like soft thunder. Lila looked up, truly seeing him for the first time. The tired lines on his face, the grief hiding behind steady eyes. She didn't know what to say, so she whispered the only truth she had. I don't know how to live like this anymore. He nodded. Then don't. Start over. That night, she lay in a bed that wasn't a cell, under a roof that didn't hum with cruelty. Outside, the rain softened, tapping gently against the window. She stared into the dark, her heart heavy yet strange with something she hadn't felt in months. Safety. The next morning, a small voice woke her. Barely a whisper. Miss. She opened her eyes to see a boy standing in the doorway, no older than 6. His hair was a tangled mess of curls, and his hands twisted nervously around a wooden toy horse. She smiled without thinking. You must be Tommy. He nodded, eyes wide. Papa says you're staying. If you'll have me, she said softly. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze. Hope, faint but alive. Then he turned and ran toward the kitchen, where Caleb was making coffee. She followed, barefoot, the floorboards cool under her feet. The smell of coffee and wood smoke filled the air, grounding her in a world that didn't ask her to kneel or obey, just to breathe. Days turned into weeks. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the barn doors, the soft nickers of horses at dawn, the long shadows stretching across the valley when the sun began to set. She worked beside Caleb, feeding livestock, mending fences, and keeping the books. Sometimes he'd glance at her with quiet appreciation, but he never said much. That was his way. One evening, while she was brushing down one of the mares, she asked him, Why did you come to Clearwater that day? He didn't look up from the saddle he was repairing. Didn't plan to, but Tommy had nightmares again. He was crying for his mama. Said she was locked in chains, and nobody would help her. I figured it was just a dream. Then I heard what was happening in town. Lila froze. You mean? He nodded. Figured maybe the good Lord sent me there for a reason. She didn't reply. The air between them held too much grief, gratitude, and something fragile neither dared name. Weeks later, Tommy started talking again. It was small at first. A word here, a whisper there. But each sound was like a spark catching fire. He'd follow Lila everywhere, asking questions, laughing shyly at her jokes. The house that once felt hollow began to breathe again. But peace is a fragile thing on the frontier. Word spread fast that Caleb Turner had bought himself a bride. Gossip travels quicker than wine through the valley, and soon whispers turned sharp. Men who had laughed at the auction now spat on the ground when he passed, calling him a fool. Women turned their backs when Lila walked into church. She bore it quietly at first, but one afternoon, she overheard 2 ranch wives outside the general store. Imagine, one of them sneered, living off a man who had to buy her like cattle. Lila stood frozen behind the shelves, shame twisting like a knife. But when she returned home, Caleb saw the hurt in her eyes and didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he went to the barn, hitched his horse, and rode into town the next morning. By noon, everyone knew what had happened. Caleb Turner had walked straight into the saloon, stood before the same men who'd mocked her, and said in a voice calm but unyielding, The woman you laughed at is the reason my boy speaks again, the reason this town still has mercy left in it. If any of you can say the same about your wives, then you can call her less than yours. Otherwise, keep her name out of your mouth. No one spoke. That night, Lila watched from the porch as he returned home, dust rising behind his horse. He looked up at her, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. For the first time since she'd been chained, she smiled back without fear. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, soft and endless. And for the first time, she believed maybe this wasn't just survival anymore. Maybe it was the beginning of belonging. The first frost came early that year. The fields around Broken Arrow Valley turned silver under the morning light, and every breath from the horses looked like smoke in the dawn. Lila stood on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the sun climb over the hills. It had been nearly 6 months since the day Caleb brought her home from Clearwater. 6 months since she'd heard laughter in this house again. Inside, Tommy was chasing their old hound dog around the stove, his giggles filling the small cabin like music. Lila smiled softly, her heart catching at the sound. She'd learned to live by the rhythm of this place. Quiet mornings, long days, and evenings where the firelight made everything feel possible again. Caleb worked hard, harder than any man she'd known, but he never once made her feel small. Still, some nights she woke to the memory of the chains, the echo of laughter from the square. She'd sit by the window until dawn, her mind tangled with things she couldn't say out loud. Caleb never asked. He just left a cup of coffee beside her each morning, as if to say he understood without needing to speak. But peace, as always, had a way of drawing envy. It started with rumors again. A trader passing through Clearwater mentioned seeing a man asking questions. Someone claiming to be Lila's husband. Word spread fast, faster than truth could keep up. Some said it was her runaway groom, back to claim what he'd left behind. Others whispered darker things. That Lila had lied about her past, that she was running from the law. When the whispers reached the ranch, Caleb found her standing by the well, her hands trembling as she drew up water. He didn't waste words. Tell me straight, Lila. Is there anyone coming for you? She met his gaze, steady but pained. There was a man once, the one I was promised to. He ran because he'd already married another woman. I thought that truth died with him. Caleb studied her face for a long moment. Then we'll face whatever comes. Together. That night, Tommy wouldn't sleep. He sensed the unease, the shift in the air. Lila sat on the edge of his bed, brushing back his hair. You're safe, sweetheart, she whispered. But the words were as much for herself as for him. The next afternoon, a stranger rode up the long path to the Turner Ranch. His coat was too fine for the frontier, his boots polished, his smirk sharp as a blade. Behind him trailed 2 hired men, rough and broad. Lila froze when she saw him dismount. Miss Lila May, the man said, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. Or should I say, Mrs. Lila Hensley? You didn't think you could hide forever, did you? Caleb stepped between them, his jaw tightening. State your business. The man adjusted his gloves, eyes cold. She's my wife. Ran off before we could reconcile matters. I've come to take her home. Lila's breath caught. You're not my husband. You married another before the vows were ever made. You broke it. He laughed. The law don't care for feelings, darling. Papers say otherwise. And in this territory, a man's claim stands, unless someone's willing to fight it. The air thickened. Caleb's hand hovered near his belt, not yet reaching for the revolver but close enough to make a point. You'll ride off this land, he said evenly. Now. The man smiled, but there was no humor in it. You think one broken rancher and his mute boy can stand against me? The sheriff's got my paperwork. I'll be back with him tomorrow. You can hand her over then, or watch your home burn. When they rode off, the silence left behind was heavier than thunder. That night, the firelight flickered low. Lila sat at the table, her hands gripping the cup Caleb had poured for her but never touched. You shouldn't have gotten involved, she whispered. He'll bring the law. Caleb shook his head. If that's the kind of law this town stands by, it ain't one worth fearing. She looked at him, her eyes wet. You could lose everything. He met her gaze steadily. I already did once. I buried my wife, near lost my boy. What's left of this place isn't about land. It's about what's right. There was a long pause before she spoke again, barely above a breath. Why did you save me, really? He stared into the flames. Because when I saw you standing there that day, I saw what this world does to people it decides are worthless. I've been one of them. I ain't letting my son grow up thinking that's normal. Her heart ached at the quiet conviction in his voice. She didn't answer, only reached across the table and placed her hand over his. For the first time since the auction, she felt the weight of her past loosen, if only a little. The next morning, before dawn, Caleb saddled his horse. He told Lila to stay inside with Tommy and keep the doors barred. If he comes with the sheriff, he said, let me do the talking. But Lila had lived too long under silence to hide again. As the sun rose, painting the valley gold, she rode down the hill behind him, determined to face the ghosts herself. Clearwater was awake by the time they reached it. The sheriff stood on the steps of his office, looking uneasy, while Hensley leaned against the post, smirking like a man who'd already won. There she is, he called out. The runaway bride. Caleb dismounted, his boots striking the ground like thunder. You got proof she belongs to you? Hensley held up a paper, folded and dirt-stained. Marriage license. Signed by her father and the judge himself. Lila stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. A license without vows means nothing. He left me at the altar. He married another woman in Ridgefield the next day. You all knew it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd gathering nearby. The sheriff looked uncertain. That true, Hensley? The man sneered. Ain't no proof of that. My wife. She's here. A voice interrupted. Heads turned as a woman stepped from the crowd. A pale, thin figure clutching a Bible. Her face was tired, her eyes hollow. I'm his wife. I have been for 3 years. He told me she was dead. The square went still. Hensley's smirk faltered. You don't know what you're talking about. The woman lifted her hand, revealing a wedding band. I do. You brought me west to bury me in your lies. I stayed quiet because I was scared. But I won't anymore. The sheriff took a long breath, jaw tightening. Mr. Hensley, looks like you've got some explaining to do. Caleb stepped closer, voice low but firm. You used her shame to settle your debts. You chained her up and called it justice. That ends today. Hensley's face twisted with rage. He reached for his gun, but Caleb was faster. In one clean motion, he drew his revolver and fired. The bullet struck the ground inches from Hensley's boots, shattering the wooden plank. Next one won't miss, Caleb said coldly. The sheriff moved in, seizing Hensley's weapon. You're under arrest for fraud and coercion. You'll answer to the judge. The crowd parted as they led him away, his curses echoing uselessly down the street. Lila stood frozen, trembling from the shock of it all. When she finally looked at Caleb, her eyes brimmed with tears. Not of fear this time, but of something deeper. Gratitude. Relief. He walked to her, his hat still low against the sun. It's over, he said softly. She shook her head. No, it's beginning. Word of what happened spread fast. For weeks after, folks in Clearwater treated her differently, not with pity, but with quiet respect. The same people who once turned their backs now nodded when she passed, their shame heavy in their silence. At the ranch, life settled back into its steady rhythm. Winter came, laying a soft white blanket over the valley. Lila spent her days teaching Tommy his letters, reading by the firelight. Caleb worked the land with a peace he hadn't known in years. One night, after supper, Tommy tugged at Lila's sleeve. Miss Lila, he whispered, are you my mama now? The question took her breath away. She looked to Caleb, who stood by the doorway, watching with a quiet smile. If you want me to be, she said softly. Tommy nodded, his small face serious. Papa smiles more when you're here. I think God sent you. Tears burned in her eyes as she pulled him close. Maybe he did, sweetheart. When Tommy was asleep, she found Caleb on the porch, staring out at the moonlit hills. She stood beside him, the cold air sharp and clean. He asked if I'm his mama, she said quietly. Caleb turned, eyes soft. What did you tell him? That maybe God sent me. He smiled, faint and warm. Then I reckon he knew what he was doing. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind whispered through the grass, the stars bright over the valley. Then Caleb reached out, took her hand gently and said, "You don't owe me a thing, Lila, but if you stay, I'd be a grateful man." She didn't answer with words. She just stepped closer, letting her hand rest against his chest where his heart beat steady and sure. The past still lived somewhere behind her, but it no longer owned her. The woman who'd been sold in chains now stood free, her dignity unbroken, her spirit stronger than ever. As spring returned to Broken Arrow Valley, the ranch filled with laughter again. The sound of Tommy's voice chasing through the fields, the low hum of Caleb's song drifting from the barn, and Lila's laughter joining theirs, bright and alive. They said the Turners' ranch became a haven for anyone the world tried to cast aside. Runaway wives, orphan children, drifters with no place to go. Caleb and Lila never turned anyone away. Maybe because they both knew what it meant to be given a second chance. Years later, when folks spoke of them, they didn't mention the auction or the chains. They spoke of the woman who rebuilt a home from ashes, and the man who gave her back her name. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the valley just right, it sounded almost like laughter, soft, free, and full of life. The kind that only comes when the heart has finally found its place. The years rolled slow and golden over Broken Arrow Valley, carrying dust, rain, and memory with them. The Turner Ranch, once quiet and hollow, now hummed with life. The barn doors swung open each morning to the sound of laughter and hooves. Chickens scratched the dirt near the porch, and the smell of bread baking drifted out through the kitchen window. It had been 3 years since the auction, 3 years since Lila May had been led onto a platform in chains. Sometimes it still came to her in dreams, the laughter, the eyes watching. But the pain no longer ruled her. It lived there quietly, like a scar that no longer stung. Caleb had taught her something simple and profound. That dignity isn't given by others, it's reclaimed. Tommy was 9 now, taller, louder, and endlessly curious. He could ride a horse like a shadow and fix a saddle better than most grown men. And though he still missed the mother he never knew, he often said, "Mama Lila, I think she sent you so Papa wouldn't be lonely anymore." Caleb would smile at that, quiet and grateful as he always was. His hair had gone grayer around the temples, his hands rougher from years of ranch work, but his eyes, those steady gray eyes, still held the same quiet strength that had stopped an auction once upon a time. The ranch had changed too. Over the years, travelers had begun to find their way there, people with nowhere else to go. The first was a young mother and her child, left behind when a mining town collapsed. Then came a drifter with half a hand and nowhere to sleep. Lila never turned them away. "Everyone deserves a sunrise," she'd say, and that became something of a promise the ranch lived by. They built extra cabins along the creek, simple wooden shelters where those in need could rest until they found their footing again. People started calling the place Haven's Rest, though Caleb and Lila never named it that themselves. But goodness, especially quiet goodness, rarely goes unchallenged in the wild. It was late one summer evening when a stranger rode in. A tall man with a scar down his cheek and a black hat pulled low. His horse was lean, restless, the kind used by men who rode fast and ran from something. Caleb was fixing a fence by the corral when the rider stopped at the gate. "You Turner?" the man asked. His voice was gravel, dry and low. Caleb nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Depends who's a skin. Name's Buck Holler. Heard you run a place for strays and beggars." Caleb's eyes narrowed, calm but alert. "We take in folks who need help. Ain't no shame in that." The man smirked. "Good. Then you'll have no trouble talking me in for a spell." Caleb studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "Stables are out back. Suppers at sundown." When Lila saw the man that evening, something in her chest tightened. There was a hardness about him that reminded her of the old days, the kind of cruelty that hides behind silence. But she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that suspicion could sometimes look a lot like fear, and she refused to live afraid. The supper, Buck didn't talk much. He ate like a man starved and kept his eyes sharp, flicking from Caleb to Lila to Tommy. When he finally spoke, It was with a sneer. Word is, you folks think you can change what this land is. Make it kind. Make it decent. But that ain't the West. Out here, people take or they get taken. Caleb looked up from his plate, calm as still water. Out here, you make your own kind of right. We chose ours. Buck chuckled, shaking his head. That's the kind of talk that gets men killed. He stayed 3 days, helped with the horses, fixed a bit of fence, and said little more. The storm that rolled over Dust Creek that night wasn't just in the sky. It was in every heart that had witnessed what happened that day. The rain came down hard, beating against the tin roofs, washing the dust off the town's sins. But it couldn't wash away what they had done to her. Clara sat by the window, her wrists still bruised where the chains had once bitten her skin. She watched lightning tear across the horizon and thought of Eli. Somewhere out there, he was trying to make peace with a world that had never been fair to either of them. Inside the ranch house, the fire crackled low, painting the walls in trembling light. Eli's son, Jacob, was asleep on the old couch, his little chest rising and falling, his small hand clutching the corner of the quilt Clara had mended for him. She brushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead, her touch gentle, protective. He reminds me of who I used to be, she whispered to herself, before they took everything. Eli came in soaked, his coat heavy with rain and regret. He paused by the doorway, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. He had just returned from town, where whispers had turned into judgment, where men called him a fool for defending her, and women crossed the street when she passed. He hung his hat by the door and spoke softly. You shouldn't have faced them alone today. Clara's voice was quiet but steady. If I keep hiding, they'll think I belong in the shadows. Eli looked at her for a long moment, then came closer, the floor creaking beneath his boots. You don't belong in anyone's shadow. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her. You belong right here, where my boy can see what courage looks like. She didn't know what to say. She had never been anyone's example of courage, just survival. But in Eli's words, she felt something new. Dignity. A quiet kind of strength that didn't need to shout. The days that followed were hard. Dust Creek had a long memory, and cruelty lingered like smoke after a fire. But the ranch began to heal in small, unspoken ways. Clara worked the fields beside Eli. Her hands blistered but her spirit unbroken. Jacob followed them everywhere, his laughter chasing away the ghosts that had haunted the land. And every evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills, Eli would look at her with that same steady gaze that said more than words ever could. You're safe now. But peace never lasts long in a town that feeds on pride and pain. One morning, Eli found a letter pinned to the barn door. It was written in rough handwriting, the kind that pressed too hard on the paper. A woman like her don't belong here. Sell her back or lose the ranch. No name, no signature. Just the mark of men too cowardly to stand by their hatred. Eli's jaw tightened as he read it. Clara saw the fury in his eyes but also the fear. Not for himself, but for her and Jacob. They won't touch us, she said, but her voice trembled. They already have, Eli replied quietly. This is their way of reminding us that mercy is a sin in their book. That night, he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, the sky full of thunder again. Clara joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. You can't fight the whole town, she said softly. He didn't look at her. Maybe not, but I can make them think twice before coming for what's mine. The silence between them was heavy, not empty, but full of everything unspoken. The rain started again, gentle this time, washing over the land that had seen too much hate. Clara turned to him, her eyes glistening. You bought me to save me, she said. But I think you're the one who needed saving. Eli smiled faintly, a weary, broken kind of smile. Maybe we both did. Weeks passed, and rumors continued to circle like vultures. But something else began to change. When the townsfolk saw Clara ride into the market beside Eli, head held high, they didn't laugh anymore. The laughter had turned into whispers, and even whispers faded when they saw how Jacob ran to her arms each time she came home. The child had no shame, no prejudice, only love. And in his laughter, Dust Creek saw what they had lost. Then came the harvest fair, the one event that could turn enemies into uneasy neighbors. Clara insisted on going, though Eli hesitated. "They'll be watching you," he warned. "Then let them," she said. "They should see what freedom looks like." The fair was loud and bright, full of color and noise. Clara wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, pale blue like the sky after rain. When she walked through the crowd, people turned. Some out of spite, some out of shame. But she didn't flinch. She carried herself with quiet grace, as if every step were a small act of defiance. At the auction booth, the same wooden platform where she'd once been chained, a hush fell when she stopped to look. Eli's hand found hers, rough and steady. "You don't owe this place anything," he murmured. She looked up at the sky, the same sky that had watched her humiliation months ago. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I owe myself peace." She stepped up onto that platform, just for a moment, her boots creaking against the boards. The crowd went still. "You all remember this place," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You remember the day you laughed. I do too. But I remember something else now, the man who didn't laugh. The man who saw a person where others saw a price." She turned toward Eli, tears glinting in her eyes. "He said his son needed me. I didn't understand then. Now I do." She looked back at the crowd, her chin lifted. "You can chain a body, but you can't chain a heart. And one day, maybe you'll remember that." No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Eli stepped forward and took her hand, helping her down. He didn't need to say a word, his gesture said everything. As they walked away, Jacob ran toward them, his laughter echoing across the square. The same people who once sneered now stepped aside. Not out of kindness, out of something rarer in Dust Creek. Respect. That night, as they rode home, Clara rested her head against Eli's shoulder. "You gave me a home," she whispered. "You gave me back my name." Eli's arm tightened around her. "You gave us something too," he said softly. "You gave us hope." The stars came out one by one, bright and clear over the open land. The road ahead was long, uncertain, but it was theirs. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was running from her past. She was walking toward her future. The storm had passed, but the sound of it lingered. Not as thunder now, but as memory. A reminder that even in a world built on cruelty, there were still those who stood tall, who reached out a hand when everyone else turned away. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. Winter came early that year, sweeping across Dust Creek like a white silence. The hills turned pale, the air bit sharper, and every sound seemed to carry farther. The ranch stood strong under its blanket of frost, smoke rising from the chimney, the smell of wood fire mixing with coffee and hay. Life had settled into a rhythm, slow but peaceful. For the first time in a long while, Clara could wake without fear in her chest. Each morning she would watch the horizon turn gold while Eli saddled the horses. Jacob, now stronger and bolder, helped wherever he could, feeding the chickens, carrying water, running through the frost with his laughter echoing in the cold air. He had started calling her Ma without even realizing it. The first time he did, Eli froze. Clara turned, tears welling before she could stop them. And all she said was, "It's all right, Jacob. You can." Life had a way of healing, slow and uneven, like the way spring followed winter, but it always came. And yet, peace in the West was never a promise. It was something you earned every single day. It started with a rider on the ridge. One morning, while Eli was checking the fence line, he saw a man on a dark horse, watching the ranch from a distance. The man didn't move for a long time. When Eli finally rode up to confront him, the stranger tipped his hat, showing a scar that cut across his left cheek. "Fine land you've got here," the man said, voice dry as sand. "You must be Eli Mercer." "I am," Eli said carefully. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure." The man smiled thinly. "Name's Clay Rowan. I used to run cattle for the Carson outfit down south." Eli nodded once. "That so?" Rowan's eyes drifted toward the house in the distance. Heard you got yourself a woman. One that used to belong to the town, if you catch my meaning. Eli's jaw tightened. She doesn't belong to anyone. Rowan chuckled. Oh, I reckon you believe that. But the men in town? They remember her. Some of them remember her too well. They don't take kindly to seeing her wearing your name. Eli's hand rested on the butt of his rifle, calm but ready. If they've got something to say, they can ride up and say it themselves. Rowan leaned forward in his saddle. They sent me to say it for them. The wind carried a long silence between them. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice low and steady. Tell them to stay off my land. Rowan smirked. I'll tell them, but you know how men are. Sometimes they like to see for themselves. He turned his horse and rode off, slow and deliberate, like a man who had said enough to start a fire and didn't care who burned. That night, Eli told Clara what had happened. She listened quietly, her hands trembling slightly around her cup. They won't stop, she said. They never do. Eli reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They will this time. But in his eyes, she saw the truth. He didn't believe it. Not fully. The following days grew tense. Every creak outside made Clara flinch. Sometimes, she saw shadows moving near the barn. But when Eli went out, there was nothing but cold wind and animal tracks. Then, one night, they heard horses again, 3, maybe 4. Eli took his rifle and stepped onto the porch. The moon was high, silvering the land. Voices drifted through the dark. Come on out, rancher. Let's have a word. Clara pulled Jacob close behind her. The boy's small fingers gripped her skirt. Eli didn't answer. He simply stood there, his rifle cradled against his arm. Rowan's voice came again, sharp and mocking. We just want to see that woman of yours. Make sure she remembers her place. Eli's tone was calm but cold as iron. You step 1 foot past that fence, and I'll make sure you never walk back. Laughter followed, ugly and hollow. Then a gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet splintered the post beside Eli's head. Clara screamed. Eli fired back once, a single shot, and the laughter stopped. The horses thundered away into the dark, leaving only silence and smoke. When Eli came back inside, Clara was shaking. They'll be back, she whispered. He looked at her, his face pale but resolute. Then we'll be ready. The next morning he rode into town. Dust Creek had always been divided, the ones who whispered and the ones who did. Eli found Rowan at the saloon, nursing a drink. The room went quiet when he walked in. I'm only going to say this once, Eli said, his voice echoing through the still air. You come near my family again, and you won't ride home. Rowan smirked. You're protectin' damaged goods, Mercer. That woman's past. Before he could finish, Eli struck him hard. Rowan hit the floor, blood on his lip. Her past is none of your concern, Eli said. But her future is mine. No one spoke. Eli tossed a few coins on the counter for the broken glass and walked out. The saloon door swung behind him, creaking like the wind. Word spread fast. Some called him a fool, others called him a man. But Clara didn't care what they called him. She only cared that he came home safe. When he did, she ran into his arms, trembling. You can't fight them all, she said, tears streaking her face. He held her close. Maybe not, he murmured. But I'll fight enough to make them think twice. The winter dragged on. Snow covered the ranch in white silence, and for a while no one came near. It was as if Dust Creek had retreated into itself, waiting for something to give. And then, one morning in late February, something did. Eli found Jacob out by the fence, holding a small piece of paper that had been pinned to the gate. The boy handed it to him without a word. It was another note. This time, there were no threats, just 3 words scrawled in charcoal. We remember her. Eli crumpled it in his fist. That night, Clara stood by the window again, watching the snow fall. They'll never forgive me, she said softly, for surviving, for being seen. Eli came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. Then let them choke on their hate. You don't owe forgiveness to people who never asked for it. She turned and looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with something more than sorrow. Pride, maybe, or gratitude, or both. "You make me believe there's still good in this world," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "There is. It's standing right in front of me." Outside, the storm howled again, but inside the house, the warmth held. Clara tucked Jacob into bed, humming softly, while Eli sat by the fire, keeping watch. The flicker of the flames reflected in his eyes, full of resolve. Because he knew one thing for certain: love was not weakness. In a world that thrived on cruelty, it was rebellion. And for that, he was willing to stand against every ghost Dust Creek could send. Spring came slowly to Dust Creek, thawing the land one stubborn inch at a time. The snow melted into streams that cut through the fields, and the wind lost its edge, carrying the scent of earth and grass instead of ice. The town seemed quieter these days. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was shame. Whatever it was, the laughter that once followed Clara Mercer whenever she walked through the streets had died. People still watched, but not like before. Some lowered their eyes. A few even nodded. Eli noticed it first, the change. "They're startin' to see you," he said one morning, leaning on the fence post while Clara fed the chickens. Clara smiled faintly. "No," she said, "they're startin' to see themselves." But peace in the West was a fragile thing. It never lasted long before the past came riding back. It was a late afternoon when the stagecoach rattled into town. Eli had gone to the smithy to fix a broken harness, and Clara was at the general store with Jacob, picking up flour and coffee. The town was calm, until the door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She wore a traveling coat dusted with road and a veil over her face. When she pulled it back, Clara felt her knees weaken. "Clara?" the woman said, her voice uncertain, trembling with recognition. It had been years, but the sound was the same. "Martha," Clara whispered. Her sister. The last time they had seen each other was the day Clara was sold. Martha had turned her back, too afraid to help, too desperate to protect her own reputation. Seeing her now was like seeing a ghost that had been waiting for the right season to return. Martha looked her up and down, eyes wide with disbelief. "They told me you were gone." Clara stood tall. They almost made it true. The air inside the store went heavy. Even the shopkeeper froze behind the counter. Martha removed her gloves slowly. "I came to make things right." Clara's jaw tightened. "You can't." "Please," Martha said. "I was wrong. We all were. When Pa died, Clara cut her off. "You did what you had to, and so did I." She turned to Jacob, who was watching quietly. "Come, sweetheart. It's time to go." But before she could leave, Martha spoke again, her voice breaking. "You have a son?" Clara hesitated, then said softly, "He's mine now. Ours." That night, Eli found her sitting outside, staring at the sky. "She's back," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "She said she wants to make things right." Eli sat beside her. "Do you believe her?" "I don't know," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "She stood there when they chained me. I looked for her face in the crowd, and she looked away." Eli didn't speak for a long moment. "Maybe she's looking back now," he said gently. Clara shook her head. "Forgiveness doesn't come that easy." The following days brought whispers again, but not the cruel kind. Martha's return stirred the town's old guilt. People began to remember. They remembered the day the auctioneer raised his voice and called out a price for a woman's freedom. They remembered the laughter, the cruelty, and the man who had stood up against it. And memory, once awakened, was harder to silence than any rumor. Martha came to the ranch a few days later. She brought a basket of bread and honey, her hands trembling as she handed it to Jacob. "For you," she said softly. The boy grinned and took it, innocent as sunlight. Eli stood at the porch, cautious but polite. "Ma's inside," Jacob said. "You can come in." Clara was by the hearth sewing. She didn't look up when Martha entered. "You can leave it on the table," she said quietly. Martha stood there for a moment, unsure whether to stay or go. "You hate me," she said finally. Clara sighed. "No. I just don't know how to remember you." Martha took a deep breath. I was scared. They said if I defended you, they'd do the same to me. I told myself I couldn't help, but I could have screamed. I could have said no. Her voice broke. And I didn't. Clara looked up, her eyes glassy but calm. You were young. We both were. Martha nodded. I can't undo what happened, but I want to stand by you now. If you'll let me. Clara studied her for a long time. The firelight flickered between them, soft and uncertain. You'll have to stand by more than me, she said finally. You'll have to stand by the truth. That night, word spread that Martha Thornton, the daughter of the man who had once ordered Clara's sale, was staying with her sister at the Mercer Ranch. For Dust Creek, it was like a wound reopening. People began to talk again, but not in the same way. The story was changing. The truth was crawling out from under years of silence. A week later, the church announced a gathering, a reconciliation meeting. They called it. Martha insisted Clara come. They need to hear it from you, she said. Not just from me. Clara was terrified. But Eli took her hand and said, You've already stood taller than any of them ever will. Let them see that. The church was packed that evening. Men in coats, women in bonnets. All eyes on the front pews where Clara sat beside Eli and Jacob. The preacher cleared his throat, but before he could speak, Martha rose. I came back because of her, she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Because of what we did to her, to my sister, to a woman who never deserved what we made her live through. The room was still. Clara could hear her own heartbeat. Martha continued, her voice growing stronger. We called it justice. We called it tradition. But it was hate, and fear, and sin. I watched it happen and said nothing. And I've carried that silence ever since. She turned toward Clara, her eyes filled with tears. But she carried the shame for all of us. Until now. The crowd murmured, restless, uncomfortable. Clara rose slowly, her hands shaking. She didn't plan to speak, but something inside her broke open. I was afraid of this place, she said softly. Afraid of your eyes, your words, your laughter, but not anymore, because I've learned something. You can't shame a person who's already survived it. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. You can't own someone's dignity. You can only lose your own trying. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the back of the church, someone stood, the old sheriff, his hat in his hands. I was there that day, he said, voice rough. And I didn't stop it. I should have. Another voice followed. So should I. Then another. One by one, people rose, their confessions spilling like rain. Martha wept. Eli put an arm around Clara's shoulders. And for the first time, the weight she'd carried all those years began to lift. Not because they asked forgiveness, but because she no longer needed to hide. When they left the church, the sky outside was painted with the first light of dawn. Clara stopped and looked back one last time. It's over, she whispered. Eli nodded. No, he said softly. It's beginning. They walked home as the sun climbed higher, Jacob's small hand in Clara's, the road ahead bathed in gold. For the first time, Dust Creek felt different. Not because it had forgotten, but because it had remembered. And in that remembering, there was healing. The weeks after the meeting felt like waking from a long, bitter dream. The town was quieter now, not out of fear, but reflection. People began to stop by the ranch not to whisper, but to lend a hand, to trade goods, to share small talk about the weather and the crops. No one said it outright, but Dust Creek was trying to make peace in its own awkward way. And Clara, for the first time, let herself believe they might. The land was turning green again, wildflowers dotting the edges of the fields. The river that ran past the southern fence shimmered like glass under the morning light. Clara spent her days tending to the garden, patching Jacob's clothes, helping Eli mend the fences. Life had fallen into a rhythm so gentle it almost frightened her, because she knew peace, like all good things, was fragile. One evening, she found Eli sitting by the porch, a letter in his hand. His face was still thoughtful. What's that? She asked, drying her hands on her apron. He hesitated. From the army office in Carson City. They're offering land further west. Fertile ground, plenty of water. They're giving new ranchers a chance to start again. Clara's heart tightened. Start again. Eli nodded. It's a long ride. Weeks, maybe months before we could build. But it'd be ours. Far from the people who hurt you. Far from what Dust Creek used to be. She looked out across the open land, the fading sunset painting it gold. This place had been her prison once, then her home. Now it stood somewhere between the two, full of memories too heavy to carry, but too sacred to abandon. Jacob came running out, his little boots thumping on the boards. Papa, Ma, look, I found a baby bird. He cupped his hands around a trembling chick. Clara smiled softly, brushing her fingers against its down. Be gentle, she whispered. It's learning how to fly. Eli watched her, eyes softening. So are we. That night, as the fire burned low, Clara couldn't sleep. She stepped outside, wrapped in her shawl, and looked up at the stars. She thought about the girl she had been when she first stood in those chains, about the woman she had become since. Every scar on her wrists, every tear she had buried. They were still there, but they didn't own her anymore. Eli joined her quietly, his footsteps soft on the porch. You're thinking about leaving, he said gently. She didn't answer right away. I'm thinking about roots, she said. And wings. He nodded slowly. You've got both, Clara. Whatever you choose, we'll follow. She turned to him, her eyes shining with that steady, brave light he'd fallen in love with. This land took everything from me once, she said. But it also gave me back my name. It gave me you. It gave me him. She looked toward the window where Jacob slept, a small shape curled under the quilt. Maybe we don't have to run anymore. Maybe staying is the braver thing. Eli smiled faintly. You've always been braver than me. Then let me lead this time, she said softly. The decision was made not in words, but in the quiet way their hands found each other in the dark. They would stay. Not because Dust Creek had changed completely, but because it was changing and someone had to help it finish. The next morning, Clara rode into town alone. The streets were busy with wagons and horses, the smell of bread and sawdust filling the air. She tied her mare outside the old auction platform, the same place where her life had been sold. The boards were still there, worn smooth by time, but someone had taken down the rusted chains. In their place hung a wooden sign, newly carved, Mercy Fairgrounds. She touched the edge of it, her fingers tracing the letters. Sheriff Lang came out of the post office and saw her. He took off his hat. Figured it was time to call it something else, he said. Figured maybe this name fits better now. Clara smiled, tears warming her eyes. It does. She spent the rest of the morning helping the local women set up stalls for the spring fair. When she laughed, it was the kind of laughter that came from freedom, deep, unafraid, real. Even those who had once turned their backs found themselves drawn to it. By afternoon, Eli rode in with Jacob perched in front of him. The boy's face was bright with excitement. Ma, Papa says we're gonna have a new barn. That's right, Eli said, grinning. We'll need it. There's talk of another horse coming in. A gift from the neighbors. Clara looked around at the faces, once cruel, now kind. A gift? She asked softly. Eli nodded. For what you did. For reminding them what decency looks like. That night, the fair lights flickered like fireflies across the open land. Music drifted through the air. Fiddles, laughter, the clink of glasses. Clara stood by the edge of the crowd, watching Jacob dance awkwardly with a group of children. Eli joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. You ever think we'd see a night like this? He asked. She smiled. No, but I think we earned it. As the music swelled, she rested her head on his shoulder. Do you ever wonder? She whispered. What would have happened if you hadn't spoken that day? If you hadn't said those words? My son needs you. He turned toward her, eyes tender. I wasn't saving you, Clara. I was saving us. You just didn't know it yet. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the firelight and his words sink deep into her chest. You gave me a life. she said. A real one. No, he said, kissing her forehead. You built it yourself. The music faded, replaced by the soft hum of the night. Stars scattered across the wide, endless sky. Clara looked up, her hand finding his. I used to think chains were made of iron, she said quietly. But they're made of fear, and when you stop being afraid, they break. Eli smiled. And yours? She looked out over the fairground, where laughter and life had replaced cruelty and shame. Mine are gone, she said. For good. The wind rustled through the grass, gentle and forgiving. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry echoing against the hills. Clara leaned into Eli, her voice a whisper. I think Dust Creek's ready to begin again. He held her closer, his breath warm against her hair. So are we. The lanterns flickered one last time before the night swallowed them whole, leaving only the stars, bright, fierce, and free. And in their quiet glow, the woman once sold in chains stood unchained at last. Not by mercy alone, but by her own unbreakable will. The town that had once laughed now looked up to her with something better than pity, respect. The rancher who once rode in with nothing but courage had found his peace. And the little boy who once reached out for a mother had found more than love. He had found a home. The prairie stretched endless before them, vast and forgiving. A promise of all that could be. And as the night settled over Dust Creek, the story of Clara Mercer became more than a memory. It became a lesson whispered in the wind. That dignity, once reclaimed, can never be taken again. The summer came slow to Dust Creek that year. The grass grew tall and golden, the kind that swayed when the wind crossed the plains like a soft breath. Life had settled into something beautiful. Not perfect, not free from work or worry, but honest. And honesty was worth more than gold in those parts. Clara woke before dawn most mornings, just as the sky blushed pale pink. She'd light the stove, boil coffee, and watch the horizon turn gold through the kitchen window. That first light reminded her of every morning she thought she'd never see. The mornings she'd begged just to live through. Now she stood in her own kitchen, barefoot, free and loved. Eli came in most days from the fields by noon, his shirt dusted in hay, his hat tipped low. He'd wrap his arms around her from behind, kiss her temple and whisper, "Smells like heaven in here." She'd laugh and swat his arm, but every time, she'd hold him a little longer, because she remembered what it felt like to have nothing to hold at all. Jacob had grown tall for his age, his hair sun-bleached, his laughter ringing through the open land. He rode his little pony fast and fearless, chasing dust trails across the fields. Sometimes, when the light caught him just right, Clara saw the ghost of the baby she'd once held in trembling arms, and then the boy he had become, strong and unafraid. The past didn't vanish. It simply learned to live quieter inside her. Some nights, when thunder rolled across the sky, Clara would still wake up in a cold sweat. The sound reminded her of the auction crowd, the laughter, the iron clinking. But then she'd feel Eli's hand reach for hers in the dark, steady and warm, and the fear would pass like a bad dream. The town, too, had changed. The old saloon now stood beside a small schoolhouse. Sheriff Lang had grown slower, grayer, but he never failed to tip his hat when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Mercer," he'd say, though she hadn't been Miss in years. The townsfolk who once stared now greeted her with smiles, some shy, some proud. The whispers were gone. Dust Creek had learned, one quiet day at a time, that shame didn't belong to the wronged. It belonged to those who caused it. One autumn evening, Clara sat on the porch with Eli as the sun sank behind the hills. The air smelled like rain and soil. Eli rested his boots on the railing and said softly, "I've been thinkin', we ought to take a trip, just us three. Show Jacob the coast. Let him see the ocean." Clara smiled at the thought. "The ocean," she repeated. "You ever seen it?" He shook his head. "Only in stories." She looked out toward the horizon. Endless, open, wild. "Then maybe it's time we write our own." They made the journey weeks later, by wagon first, then by train. It was Jacob's first time seeing so many people in one place, and Clara's first time seeing herself as one of them. Not as an outcast, not as a victim, but as a woman who had survived and built something beautiful. When they reached the coast, the sea stretched before them, endless and blue, breathing with the rhythm of the earth itself. Jacob ran ahead, shouting, laughing as the waves chased his feet. Eli stood beside her, silent, eyes wide with wonder. Clara let the wind whip through her hair. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just watched the tide roll in and out, carrying the sound of gulls and faraway ships. Then she stepped forward, letting the cold water touch her boots. "This," she whispered, "this feels like freedom." Eli smiled faintly. "You earned it." She turned to him, her eyes bright. "No," she said softly. "We did." They stayed there until the sun dipped low, until the waves turned gold under the fading light. Jacob picked up seashells, his laughter carried by the wind. Eli drew her close, his arm around her waist. "I think," he said, "if heaven looks like this, I wouldn't mind going there someday." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We already made our heaven, Eli. Right here." The years rolled on, as years do. Dust Creek grew from a lonely dot on the map into a proud little town. The kind travelers stopped in to rest and trade, never knowing the stories the land held. Clara taught the women to read, to manage their own accounts, to own what they built. Eli expanded the ranch, teaching Jacob how to ride, how to mend fences, how to be kind before he was strong. And when the nights grew long and the fire burned low, Clara would sit by the window, looking out at the same moon that once shone down on her chains. She'd think of the laughter that had tried to break her, and the man who silenced it with 4 simple words. "My son needs you." Those words had been her salvation once. But over the years, she came to understand something deeper, that Eli hadn't spoken them out of pity or heroism. He had spoken them because he saw her humanity when no one else did. Because sometimes love isn't thunder or lightning. Sometimes it's the quiet mercy of someone saying, "You still matter." When Jacob grew older and took over the ranch, he often asked about that day, the one no one in town spoke of anymore. Clara would tell him the truth, not to make him angry, but to make him grateful. "Son," she'd say, "the world will try to tell you what a person's worth is. Don't you ever believe it. Worth isn't sold. It's lived." And he carried those words like a compass. Years later, when she and Eli were gone, people still spoke of Clara Mercer. Not as a tragedy, but as a legend. The woman who walked into Dust Creek in chains and left it freer than it had ever been. The woman who faced down cruelty with courage, who rebuilt her life with dignity and quiet grace. There's a small plaque now, near the fairground where the chains once hung. It doesn't tell the whole story, because stories like hers can't be captured in a few carved lines. But if you walk by it in the morning light, you can read the words etched deep into the wood. "Here stood a woman who was sold, but never broken." The wind still hums through Dust Creek, carrying the scent of wild sage and memory. And if you listen closely, you might swear you can hear the echo of a man's voice, rough and kind, carried on the breeze, the voice that changed everything. "My son needs you." And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, Clara still walks the edge of that horizon, unbound, unafraid, and free. Because some stories don't end where they're written. They live on, in the land, in the people, in the quiet places where dignity once took root and refused to die.